Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Industrial Real Estate Show. I'm your host, Chad Griffiths. I'm very excited for a episode this week, which I actually filmed last week. I was going to save it for this coming Saturday, but my guest for today actually had to cancel at the last minute. So I'm going to run this pre-recorded one today. Two experts who are consultants in site selection, Tondy and Kevin from Hickey and Associates. We talked about the South Asian markets, specifically about industrial real estate, and how these markets are looking very appealing for all the companies that are looking for that China plus one strategy, where they're looking to diversify the supply chain. And we talked all about some of the major South Asian markets, get into the weeds on this a bit. It was a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot myself, and I think you will as well. I'll also be tuned in live, so if you want to leave a comment or a question, or smash the thumbs down button and let me know about it, do that in chat. I'll be joined in live for this as well, and I'd love to chat with anybody that's tuned in. Without further ado, pleased to be joined by Kevin and Tondy. Well, good afternoon, gentlemen. I should say good morning to you, Tondy. It's 6 a.m. where you are right now. So good afternoon, Kevin. Good morning, Tondy. Thank you both so much for joining me on the show.
Well, it's great to be here, Chad. And as I said, it's Hickey's a global organization, so we do need to be culturally sensitive. And I appreciate your flexibility in providing a time slot that we could have both your time zone and the Eastern U.S. time zone and Singapore, which is 6 a.m. in the morning. So we're all used to very odd calls at very odd times of the day to make sure we stay connected.
So how do you do that? Actually, I'm genuinely curious, but I deal with a lot of different time zones day to day in North America, where it's at max 3 hours difference. But how do you schedule around all the massive different time zones where it's morning versus night?
There was always someone who is the unfortunate person who needs to get up in the middle of the night or the very early morning or late at night. I mean, we span the globe. Hickey's a global site selection firm, so we have offices and people around the world. So when you look at the West Coast and the East Coast and all the time zones in between, plus all the European time zones, plus Asia time zones, going from, India, which is 9.5 hours ahead, all the way to Australia, which I believe is 16 hours ahead, it gets very difficult. So the cultural sensitivity is you tell your team members that, hey, you're, as a global organization, you need to understand that you're not U.S. centric or Canadian centric or Mexico centric. You're global centric. So everyone needs to put their time in and understand that things don't revolve around us in the Eastern United States.
And in this case, Tondy drew the short straw by having to get up early in the morning.
It's okay, Chad. So, like Kevin said, we are very globally working as a global team. So there's also an element of understanding on what's the challenge on the other part. So sometimes it doesn't work. So we just need to sometimes organize 2 meetings to discuss actually the same thing. That's fine with us. So that's also one of the aspects of being culturally sensitive, as what Kevin mentioned. So I really appreciate that. That happens in Hickey and Associates.
And I do want to dive into Southeast Asia specifically with you guys. And before we do that, I'd like to have you give a little bit more information on 2 things. First, I'd like to just have you describe site selection and what that process is and what that process involves. And then also just Hickey and even yourselves. Three things, actually. I'd love to hear what site selection is, what is Hickey, and then your guys' background. And you don't need to go into it in great detail, as much as you feel comfortable with.
Right. So Tondy, I'll start off. So site selection, in a nutshell, is helping companies figure out the right locations and the right places to locate their facilities, so it helps them implement their business strategies. Right. We do everything from comparing countries down to markets within countries, down to site quadrants within markets, down to specific sites. So everything, 3 major areas. One is site selection, which is analysis and comparative analysis of alternatives for sites. The second one is labor analytics, helping companies understand where their labor is going to come from, which has become incredibly important lately. And then thirdly, incentives, right? So they're with all the new legislation and governmental programs around the world. Really, there's so much money to help companies locate, and we help them procure and negotiate the incentives packages. So it's really a nuts to bolts solution from network optimization, site selection. We're not real estate brokers. We partner with a lot of different consultants and partner with the individual companies. We work with brokers, developers, occupiers, really just to help them locate the right things. Personally, myself, I'm new to Hickey and Associates. I've joined a year ago. I used to head up corporate real estate, global real estate for Haynes and Sara Lee for many years, and spent a significant amount of my time building a supply chain, helping build a supply chain over in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular. So several million square feet. So quite a bit of experience in the region. With that, Tondy, I'll let you describe yourself and your take on Hickey and Associates.
Yes, I came from corporate real estate background, Chad. So I was with Colliers for a long time, for 24 years. And then later I joined LinkedIn as the head of real estate in Asia Pacific. And then I moved over to Uber. So it was a big experience for me in terms of location strategy. So in the past, what I did was just looking into demand and supply of real estate, and then suggest to clients of which one is the right location based on that two factors only, demand and supply. But when I was at LinkedIn and Uber, I was exposed to more reality of how corporate work. In this case, locating offices in where the labor is available, the labor pool. And at that time, I appointed Hickey. So Hickey was my favorite consultant at that time, where in my business case, I presented the topic of where the labor availability is for the best location for Uber at that time. Because at that time, Uber was expanding and I was mandated to double the portfolio. So we will be hiring 3,000 plus 2,000 people in India into cities. So it's no longer about real estate demand and supply. It's all about where is the labor pool and how would we be located in a strategic location to be able to hire this labor pool. And then later I realized there are more aspects to it, like grant and incentives, ESG, supply chain. So those are the things that is a lot more dominant than just demand and supply, at least from the corporate way of thinking, Chad.
Oh, that's very interesting. I appreciate how you guys both have different backgrounds, but have used all those skills that you've harnessed along the way to where you're at currently. That's a very cool complement of skills there. So I'd love to actually just jump right into Southeast Asia's market. And I've heard you both mention that labor is a major consideration right now. What are some of the major considerations beyond labor that companies evaluate when they're considering perhaps staying in Southeast Asia? So it could be companies that already have a spot there, or it could be a company in North America or even Western Europe that wants to expand and they want to consider Southeast Asia. So I guess that'd be the question for companies already there or companies that are considering moving to that area. With labor being a dominant one, what are some of the other considerations and what are some of the attractions on why Southeast Asia looks good right now?
Yeah, so the genesis of the paper really was a major real estate conference that was over there in Singapore. And with the expertise that Hickey has in Southeast Asia, we said, well, what's happening in the world and how should we look at Southeast Asia? And we're looking at Southeast Asia, and companies are looking at Southeast Asia in a whole new light. They've been there, been operating. It's been a great place to operate for many years. I personally started in Vietnam in 2006 when they joined the World Trade Organization. But we're in the post-pandemic world. And, we thought the post-pandemic world has changed everything, but it's just gotten more confusing, right? The pandemic really blew up supply chains. That was the start. Then everything started coming on top of that, the geopolitical tensions, security issues, new free trade agreements, trade wars, the deglobalization, just everything converging at once. So companies have started coming to Hickey and saying, what are our alternatives? And we said, well, have you looked at Southeast Asia? Southeast Asia as a bloc, the ASEAN nations, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is one of the largest trading blocks in the world. So I've I take it for granted because I've done work there for so long. And what the reality of it is, it's got so many favorable characteristics as far as what companies are looking for. Number one, labor. Skilled labor, all the way down to low skilled labor to high-tech manufacturing across all the board, across all 11 nations, right? The demographics are very, very favorable. Lots of young people growing, continuing urbanization, right? Which means a lot more people for the labor pool, and also keeps labor rates down, right? A burgeoning middle class, consumer class with lots of money to spend, high tech, right? So favorable, lots of land, favorable resources, just a whole lot of things that really make the area look really favorable for companies. So as companies look to figure out their supply chain and rethink it, it's not just a China plus one strategy, it's a Taiwan plus strategy. Companies aren't going to they're going to nearshore, but there's alternatives to nearshoring, and that's staying in the Asian markets and figuring out how to serve those Asian markets from other areas. And Southeast Asia becomes very attractive from those standpoints. Tondy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, the population, the size of population in Southeast Asia is almost 700 million. So that is not that far different to India or China, right? So, and if we look at that, and then they are growing so organically, so significantly, it's just number one, it's a market by itself for many of the products and services by companies. Number two, it's the right location to produce those products or assemble or manufacture those products themselves. So very, very interesting region in the world right now, Chad.
Thanks for that answer. And Kevin, you brought up a point that came to mind was the trend of nearshoring, or some U.S. companies are onshoring, reshoring. Do you see that as being a threat to global supply chain and some of these markets in Southeast Asia where companies are trying to move away from that? Or is as simple as you suggested, that this is still a very viable strategy where companies can take advantage of cheaper labor and it still makes sense from a financial standpoint? Or do you see that reshoring perhaps being overblown in the news for what's actually happening?
I don't think nearshoring and reshoring is overblown, but I think it's not what people think. It's not about moving operations back to the West. It's about balancing your supply chain. Right? It's about making sure that you have a resilient supply chain where you can supply your customers with your product in any case of worldly disruptions, right? Security, transportation. And I think that's what companies are rethinking. Now, Southeast Asia is not going to be hurt from nearshoring and reshoring. It's going to gain, actually, because as companies considering a China plus one strategy, figuring out how to stay in China and access those markets, Southeast Asia is just becoming much, much more attractive. Again, the labor rates are far more advantageous to the West. Population and the availability of labor, the availability of land, the perceptions of doing business there are changing. They have wrongly perceived issues with business issues, and the world's being educated to Southeast Asia. But most of it, in fact, there's a lot of foreign direct investment flowing from China back into Southeast Asia as companies move. And you've seen a lot of companies announce, some of the major tech companies announcing they're moving out of China, but they're not moving back to the United States. They're moving into other parts of Asia, and Southeast Asia and India are the main benefactors of that.
That makes sense. So is there a net loser in this? Or is it just a matter of this reshifting is going to involve a lot more countries and a rising tide raises all boats sort of scenario? Or is China and other countries at risk of actually losing some market share? Is that on the table?
Todd, do you want to take a stab at that?
I don't think so, Chad. China is still big, and they are consuming a lot of the products and services themselves. But I think what happened is the growth is balanced out. So it's not only about China being the largest factory floor in the world, but now there is a balance. There are growth in Southeast Asia. There is growth in India also, for instance. So I think the whole economy globally is still expanding. So that's what happened. I don't think there is a net loser in this case. That's how I see things in my view. Kevin?
Yeah, the only way there's going to be a net loser is depending on the geopolitical and trade issues, right? I mean, all the free trade agreements are being restructured. We have the trade war. I mean, we have to admit what's going on. Tariffs are being slapped on everyone. So, the only losers are going to be the people that come out on the bad end of tariffs and free trade agreements. And the world has in the last 25 years has experienced an incredible globalization where you can move products freely around everywhere, right? And that system is breaking down for a number of reasons. The trade wars. You have the United States actually kind of a bit of deglobalization, right? They're not necessarily as interested in globalization anymore, and they're pulling back on securing the world's trade routes. And as you know, for the last 80 years, the world has had free trade based on the United States guaranteeing security through all the trade routes, and that's all shifting. So what's happening is you have a regionalization going on in the world. So nations are jockeying, Europe and Japan and ASEAN and China, ASEAN and Europe, and everyone's jockeying with all types of new free trade agreements. And we highlight this in the paper that we don't know who the winner's going to be yet, but everyone's trying to figure out how they best set up, for the future. And, Europe just went through the Brexit. They're figuring out their free trade agreements, right? So everyone's kind of jockeying for position, and there should not be a net loser. But again, it's up to the nations and what happens with the geopolitical tensions. I mean, we're at an unprecedented time where the Bretton Woods Convention is kind of breaking down, and there's a whole new era of regionalization and security emerging, and no one knows where that's going to fall.
Yeah, great point, both of you. Can you just go into that ASEAN description a little bit more? So 11 nations, 700 million people in that area, as Tondy mentioned. Is it an actual organization, or is it a loose association, or is it meant to just describe a regional term? Or can you just break down what that is more?
Sure. Tondy, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take that?
Let me start, and then I hand over to you, Gavin. So let me just list down the countries as what we classify or group as ASEAN: Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And they are organized under ASEAN, Southeast Asian Nation Association. So in fact, they just had a high-level summit, the presidents and all the state leaders of the ASEAN countries 2 weeks ago, I think, in Indonesia. And what they do is they meet regularly, and they kind of align their policies. And one of the outcome of the summit in the 2 weeks ago is a more in sync policies and agreement about a Myanmar crisis. There is also an agreement about development of electric vehicle program across the region. There is also a discussion or agreement about protection of migrant workers. Please note that these are countries, so covering 700 million population, there are migration here and there. So there is an agreement about protecting migrant workers, which is a hot topic on a separate note on the topic of ESG, which Kevin is an expert of also. So those are the how the mechanics of these countries are operating, Chet. Kevin?
Yeah, the organization has actually been around, I believe, since the 1980s. You'll have to Google that and check it, but it's been around for quite a while. And the reason was just to have all the countries participate and understand the leverage and negotiation of the region as a whole as an economic entity. And as an economic entity, they obviously have to work on a lot of the issues on the politics, right, and the policies. But it's become a much stronger organization in the last couple of years. They have very strong programs on negotiating free trade agreements. They negotiate basically as a bloc with all the other regions of the world and all the other countries of the world. They negotiate, a very strong. They understand issues with the country, such as renewable resources. So they have an incredible amount of natural resources. They're high in coal and oil, but they understand the value of renewable energy. So they've got a tremendous program on developing renewable energy and moving towards renewable energy. And that as a bloc, then they have much more strength. It's probably the third or fourth largest trading bloc in the world, which people don't realize. So it competes very effectively with Europe and the United States. It's not nearly as big as the United States or China, but it's a very effective trading bloc. It's becoming much stronger, as I said, and there are always issues because you have different governments, different things happen. You have different democracy types. You have some communist types there. So it's been relatively effective. Most people understand ASEAN, but in the new world of what's going on with post-pandemic and the geopolitical issues, it's becoming much more recognized as a regional powerhouse block of economics, labor, good demographics. Most of the countries in the world, many countries in the world are having, demographics are horrible. Declining population. China, just for instance, first year of population decline. But the demographics of the population pyramids and demographics of the ASEAN nations are very healthy, showing they have a replacement population. There's a nice young growing population, high skilled, lots of great cities, great universities, et cetera. So it's really becoming recognized now, and companies, we spoke to one significant supply chain VP over there a couple of months ago, and he was right on saying they love Southeast Asia and they're growing as much as they can there. And the beauty about Southeast Asia, you can have an entire supply chain built in the Southeast Asian countries within a relatively small geographic area, everywhere from the low-skilled laborers who are just coming out of agricultural markets all the way up to high-tech advanced manufacturing. And you see that in cities such as Singapore and Kuala Lumpur and Ho Chi Minh City and Bangkok, world-class cities, lots of talent, great people, young people, low labor, and populations that are willing to work, and they work very, very hard, right? Good ethics.
Yeah, it does sound like there's a lot of benefits to people considering that. What are one of the drawbacks that perhaps comes to mind, or one of the impediments, I should say, is language barriers, as it would be for a company deciding to move to any foreign country? How many within that union or block of 11 nations, how many different languages are there spoken in there, or common ones, I should say, because there's probably an unlimited amount of different languages,
right?
Languages.
Tondy, that's your expertise.
Well, you're right, Chad. Naturally, I think there are thousands of languages here in ASEAN, but English is a dominant language spoken, especially with the younger generation. So, and it's just the reality of the whole social media, globalization, TV, whatsoever. All the young population speaks English fluently, and they are rapidly embracing that as their main language, especially in the largest cities, right? So I don't think language is an issue nowadays. And I think respectfully, every country has their own legal, also formal language. It could be Chinese, it could be Indonesian, it could be Malay, it could be Tagalog, but English is widely spoken in the region.
So actually,
yeah, and Philippines is widely known as the place where companies are putting call centers and back office operations because of their language skills, right? So incredible English skills there. And honestly, I've traveled there for 15, 16 years on business in almost every ASEAN country, and I've never had a problem. English is the language of business. and countries recognize that to participate in the world, that they need to be able to communicate in English. Honestly, the only issues we've ever really had was when you go out into the far rural areas, right? But there's people, translators that will help you, because a lot of the industries push out into the rural areas, depending on the structure of the labor market, and that's where you run into English problems, because there's not the development there.
Which would make sense. And
right.
One of you alluded to it earlier as well, is just dealing with different governments, different political structures, that there's a learning curve that would have to go into place on that as well. What do companies often do, or what's common when they're moving into a new country, and suppose they choose Malaysia? How do you actually bring yourself up to speed on all the different issues, which are going to be, I'm sure there's similarities with like the US, where some things are consistent, but I'm sure there's also things that are quite a bit different. How does a company bring themselves up to speed on that?
Don, you want to address that, or you want me to handle that one?
Well, the first thing is they should contact us, because we keep an eye on all the development of even the regulation that is in process or in discussion at the parliament level. We keep an eye on those things. And it's rapidly changing, right? And what we see so far is anything to do with ESG is very high level in terms of priority by the governments. So if a company is looking at ESG as one of their biggest criteria in location selection, or ESG is a big thing within the company goals, this is an opportunity to look at ASEAN, because each of the countries are very committed. And as I mentioned to you, even 2 weeks ago, there is a discussion about electric vehicle network in ASEAN, discussed by the state level leaders. So please contact Kevin or I, and we will be more than happy to consult these companies.
Well, yeah. So the high level process, Chad, is really the company first needs to figure out what its critical location factors are. What are they trying to accomplish in locating or staying here? Right? Is it low skilled labor? Is it medium skilled labor? Is it high skilled labor? What type of industry they are? We have significant clustering of industries in different countries, and we analyze that for companies and say, here's where this cluster of companies is located. Here's where your electricity, your dominant electricity, water resources are. Here's where the particular labor is suited to your company. So we do high level assessment, and that's what this paper kind of starts identifying, a comparative analysis between the countries. Then you start digging in deeper, right? Once you start eliminating a couple countries, then you say, and we're good at creating teams to help companies enter markets. So number one, you're going to need obviously a good accounting and tax firm, right? Number two, you're going to need a good legal team, right? There are a lot of myriads to jump hoops on, and we're not by any an accounting firm or a legal firm, but we specialize in site assessments and comparative analysis. But a company must assemble a very strong team of HR, supply chain, network, legal, and from that teaming, then you work together to figure out again what your location factors are, and you start digging down. Okay, you choose couple countries, then you start choosing a couple markets within those countries and do a compare, and you work yourself way all the way down into the sites, individual sites, and where the best locations possibly could be, and you weight different location factors, and you have a sensitivity model that says, well, this is more important than this, and you can change with the weighting of them to see how the different locations, kind of start to filter out based on your location criteria. That's a long process, but that's an overall how you work from a high level assessment down into down to individual sites.
Yeah. I mean, I think you did a pretty good job of clarifying that it's a process, and you distilled that into short form. But I can appreciate that is a long process, and I'd also appreciate that your role as consultants isn't necessarily to be salesmen for Southeast Asia any more than it would be to be salesmen for the US. Your role is to provide people the best information on all the different markets so that they can make a decision based on what you're providing them. So I think that's an important distinction as well, because I'm asking you all these things about Southeast Asia, but and I would fully appreciate how someone would have to hire a consultant like you guys to go through this process, to navigate that without having consultants and all that information available seems daunting and probably unwise. So I can really.
Well, it's all about the data and the data sources and understanding where the data sources are and how to filter through the fluff and get to the real data. Right. We also do a significant amount of ground truthing, which means we get in and we interview companies. This is what we're hearing. This is what the data is saying. Tell us what your experience is. So, it's not just data sources. It's actually primary ground truthing research to say, okay, here's an area we picked. We went out and interviewed all these companies to, interview the HR managers, the supply chain managers, the transportation managers to figure out and say, hey, this is what we're hearing. Tell us what you're seeing in the marketplace.
To dig into that a little bit further, actually, I'd love to just explore the supply chain side of Southeast Asia, and I'd love to start by just even getting a better understanding of how goods are distributed across the various countries. So, with it being a union, if you're going across 3 different countries, there, are you dealing with 3 different sets of government having to import and export, or does that block? Is it the intent to allow for quicker flow of goods?
Andy, you want to take that? You want me to take it?
Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I mean, the trade routes are pretty well set and the companies cooperate. You do have different regulations you need to go to, but essentially every country has their own port you get to, right? And ports are all important there, and there are significant ports. There's a $15 billion infrastructure investment in the Singapore port. I think it's probably the 2nd largest port in the world, next to Shanghai, maybe something like that. Vietnam's investing a lot of money. So really, it's access to the ports within individual countries. Vietnam has its port-tied ports, so every country has its major ports. Most of those ports predominantly will flow through either Hong Kong or Singapore, and then through the trade routes over to either Europe or the U.S. So, really the biggest issue in that is access to the ports from the location within the country. And then because there are some countries that aren't quite there yet with their transportation networks, not to pick on Vietnam, but Vietnam still has quite a network of 2-lane roads. Right, but you see it in many developing areas in the world where the business gets ahead of the infrastructure, right? But all the countries understand the significance of the ports and just tremendous investment in it.
Does every country in there have at least 1 major port then? So is there at least 11 major ports?
Yeah, there's even more ports than that. Vietnam has several. Thailand has several. I can't speak specifically, but yeah, ports are a major investment opportunity. And there's a lot of money pouring into the port infrastructure, FDI, foreign direct investment, and country subsidies of ports.
Well, I suppose that's a pretty competitive advantage for them when the U.S. had all those port bottlenecks, particularly off Los Angeles and Long Beach, and everything ground to a halt on that. There wasn't a whole lot of options. You could go through the Panama and you could try to port on one of the East Coast ports, but they're not designed to handle that huge inflow of activity either. So that really caused a lot of bottlenecks in the supply chain in the U.S. And I suppose if one country in that ASEAN market had an issue with one of their ports or major ports, what I'm inferring is that you can go redirect to another port, and then those trade routes are already there, so you can still keep that supply chain up and running. A fair way of describing it?
Yeah, there's a lot of jockeying in the ports in ASEAN countries too. I mean, they have their issues with the ports, and I know several times we had to redirect ports into it. Look at how you get to a different port in a country or cross border to get into another country into a port, and you have some geographic considerations too when you're going from Thailand over to Vietnam. You've got some major mountains to go through. So, but the good news is the supply chain disruption has made everyone rethink those and come up with resiliency plans on what happens if this happens to this port, or this happens to this country, or this country shuts down because of a pandemic. The different countries in ASEAN had different attitudes towards the pandemic, right? And it was hard keeping supply chains moving when a country would demand that all the factories shut down, right? Wasn't necessarily as bad as the China shutdown, but some of the ASEAN countries had their issues also.
What's most of the travel on land? Is there a rail network in place, or is it mostly just by truck?
Mostly by truck. Tondy, tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, the rail infrastructure is not really built out, and the geography of many of these countries doesn't lend itself to the railroad networks. But mainly by truck.
Yes, mainly by trucks, and also as you mentioned, by ship through ports, right? Because this is quite thousands and thousands of islands in Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand too, Vietnam too, right? So it is a lot more complicated than when you speak about supply chain compared to Europe or US, for instance, because it's all one land and all well connected by roads and by railway, etc. This is a lot more complicated, and within that, this is a combination of a number of countries, right? So then we need to look into where the labor pool is. We cannot just move a million people from this country to another country or etc. Right? So it needs to be really looked into carefully, and Kevin is our expert in this and looking into the entire supply chain. Where is the raw material? Where is the labor pool? Where should we assemble? Which port will that be, etc. But it's all workable, and then with a bit more analytics, I think we will be able to create or help companies to look into how to create a sustainable and a reliable supply chain network, plus with all the risk of the pandemic or the country changes in terms of policy, free trade agreement, etc. So it's a fascinating, but yet there are a lot of opportunities within this region.
The one thing you touched on, Chad, that we need to make sure we mention is there's a lot of misperceptions about the countries, and we deal with, when I talked about putting together a team, there are a lot of misperceptions about corruption and payoffs and the ease of doing business. You can work through all those. It's not difficult, but there's a lot of those high-standing perceptions out there. I was on the phone with a significant European manufacturing company, and their chief legal officer just didn't want to go to Vietnam because they had such bad perceptions about it. It was just perceptions. So we got on the phone through them. We walked through a lot of the issues that companies are doing business there, the sophistication of the attorneys and the accountants that are there, and gave her a comfort level that, okay, you're right, we will consider doing business there. So it's just, there are a lot of those perceptions. There's, we've got governmental structure, right? Whether it's communist or what kind of democracy it is, you've got corruption issues, business practice issues. Most companies have very strong programs in place to protect against that. And when you do training in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and as long as companies have strong programs in place, they won't have any issues with that, right?
Yeah, it's funny as you're.
So there are risks. What we're saying, there are risks, but they're easily overcome, right?
Well, and there's risks with every country. A lot of U.S. companies have no problem dealing with China, but we're all well aware of the same risks that are there. So it's funny how some people will say, well, happy to do business in China, but we won't consider Malaysia or Philippines because we have this conception. Right. And even that conception can't possibly be worse than what you already know, what is going on in China. So that's funny how they approach that. On the industrial side specifically, and I don't know if you will necessarily have the answers to this, but when you're looking at industrial, there's the manufacturing side where they're making goods, and then there's going to be the warehousing side where they're storing the goods. Are most of those facilities going to be within short distance of the port, or are you going to see inland developments as well?
A good question. I don't know what is contemplated by a short distance of the port. Right. I mean, but most of them will be within, at least a 4 to 6 hour drive, generally, because they're all fairly close to the water anyway. Right. So they're close to the ports. So that generally isn't that much. The transportation to the ports, not that big of an issue. Right. And yeah, there's congestion on the 2-lane roads, but it's generally not, it's easily overcome. That's not the cost savings based on the labor and doing business over there far outweighs any transportation costs to the port and the port structure.
What does the ownership structure of the buildings look like? So a large company wants to consider Vietnam. Is it common for them to go and buy their own land and build, or is it more common for them to find a partner and either lease existing space or find someone to do a build to suit essentially, and then they just become a tenant? And maybe it differs across all 11 nations, but is there one more common than the other?
Yeah, the land ownership is it's significantly different between the nations. For instance, in Vietnam, you can only lease land, but you can do 57-year leases, right? And with the industrial markets, it's you wanted to get into real estate. It's not a open competitive market like it is in Europe and the US. It's not, industrial brokerage is not that well developed outside of the markets or actually within some of the cities. So it's up to the company to do their own ground truthing and hire companies like us to go in and do the ground research to find the buildings. And then you're negotiating basically with the single owners of the buildings to lease or to buy. You can buy the building, but you can't buy the land. You lease the land, right? You'll see a lot of the more professional investors, large warehouse REITs getting into the markets because it's a growing consumer demand requiring warehousing of goods for distribution to the consumer market. Predominantly up until this time, it's been in manufacturing for export markets, right? But as the middle class, consumer class starts to grow, there's a lot of warehousing development going on for the in-country consumer distribution.
So when they're
Todd, you've got more experience in some of like Malaysia, and I don't know what the land laws are.
Right. So I think the supply is there, plentiful. It's all about getting to know or to be in touch with logistics or developers specializing in industrial properties. Lease is the most convenient, the quickest, and also the most feasible model of providing the space. But build to suit is an option. So if your facility requires a certain technical difference to what is available, most of the developers, landlords are more than happy to build you one that will be suitable to you. But anywhere that you would want to go, I think I would confidently say that there will be supply of real estate already in the market.
But there's not an open warehousing of information. There's no LoopNet, anything like that. It's good old fashioned field work. You're on the ground, knocking on doors, right? You see a building and it looks vacant or something. You knock on the door and say, "Hey, what's going on with this building?" Right? I mean, that's the way it's done. The brokerage is not well established. The brokerage is well established in the office markets and residential and retail. Very far behind in industrial and warehousing. It's just there hasn't been the market. It's not been an open source market for that type of product.
It almost sounds like there's an opportunity for some enterprising individual or company to go and try
and you'll see them. Yeah, you'll see them. But a lot of the markets are dealt. The major brokerage houses are based in Hong Kong and Singapore and Bangkok to an extent. But you don't see a lot of the industrial real estate brokers actually housed in the country. It's changing, but it's still developing.
So that's interesting because it adds another challenge because I'm sure when you're going through the site selection and you're going through at a high level on what countries could be of interest, still a major fundamental step would be you've got to find if there's a building that actually works for what they want to do. And that's
right.
Why I was curious on the investment side is that if there's already a building there and there's a landlord there, then that's great, then that works. But if they're trying to come up with a unique building or something unconventional, there needs to be either someone willing to provide the land or there needs to be someone that's willing to build it for them and do a rent back. So it's good to hear that there's players there that are willing to do it. Just doesn't sound like it's very organized.
Yeah, the investment market investor market is very immature there as the economies grow. It's starting to change. You have the big REITs going in for warehousing and everything, but when you look at a piece of property, and normal question to you, Chad, as a broker or in the United States, well, what are the comparable properties selling for? Well, there are no comparable properties, so it's what you're willing to pay for it and what the owner is willing to lease it to you for or sell it to you for. right? There's no such thing as a market valuation per se. You can find some data, but data is very scarce. It's not the wild west, but it's back to the good old days of boots on the ground type real estate work, right? I mean, when I was doing work, I could find no brokers that could do the industrial. So I was using site selection firms like Hickey and Associates to go out and really you go to a market and knock on the doors. That's how basic it gets.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so maybe this is a naive question. Maybe it should be an obvious answer, but are buildings relatively similar to where you're going to find in other markets, as like tilt-up concrete construction or pre-insulated metal panels, or how are these buildings built? I can't even picture one, to be honest. So I need to do some more research on this.
Not the standards that the U.S. would expect. I mean, it's metal buildings, basically. Right. They use it's cheap construction, very cheap. You spend a lot of time enhancing current structures to U.S. standards or to safe standards. A lot of the work I've done was you'd find shell buildings and then we'd build them out to U.S. specifications. Right. So the build-to-suits we'd obviously build to our own specifications. And there are a number of construction companies in Southeast Asia that specialize in U.S. building or Western building standards that help companies do that. But if you're out, a new construction with investors are being built to higher standards, but generally a lot of the buildings are being built by companies themselves to their own standards. Tondy, does that fall in line with what you're seeing?
I think there are two possibilities. What I would suggest is looking into industrial park, where they are already a big developer or landlord building buildings, and these are typically very compatible with US or European standard and FPA standard, etc., for fire safety, etc. So that's an easier solution. But if you do really want to go out in the wild and for your own reason, like being close to your supply chain, etc., then there is this challenge. And there are companies, consultants who can help you build and specify what you want, and then help either building, ask the landlord to build for you as a build to suit, or you need to do it yourself. So those are the two routes. The easier one is go to industrial park, and they are plentiful in the entire ASEAN, or you go your own way and build your own, and that will be a bit more complicated. That's exactly what Kevin said.
Yeah, Tondy brings up a good point. A very strong network of industrial parks and dealing with the industrial park owners, right? But they're generally locally owned or owned by significant entrepreneurs within the company or within the country. But they have nice products and they know how to deal with U.S. companies or Western companies, so they're becoming much more sophisticated. Again, the issue with brokerages, they don't understand the brokerage community, so they don't obviously necessarily pay brokerage fees. So there's always the proverbial dispute between landlord, tenant, and broker as to who's paying what, right? And how people are being compensated for the work. But the industrial parks are quite significant.
And I'm guessing there's a lot of government support to build these and attract more companies. That probably seems like the mission of ASEAN as an organization, is to attract more business. So I'm sure there's a lot of government support for this. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Yeah. You'll see the foreign direct investment growing substantially. The foreign direct investment is growing into ASEAN is growing faster than I think any other country in the world. I'd have to check that statistic, but it's growing pretty strong, right? And it's continuing. So you don't see outflow of stuff from ASEAN. You see a significant inflow, and a lot from China, a lot from Japan, a lot from the other ASEAN nations in between the ASEAN nations, a lot of European FDI into the ASEAN countries. So the potential is strong as a powerhouse, economic, labor, demographic powerhouse. Absolutely.
And I'm sure it will continue to develop too, and it'll iron out those kinks where there might not have a whole lot of data available, or it's not as easy of a system to navigate through on the actual real estate side. I'm sure as it grows, there'll be people that just try and find solutions to some of those perceived problems that are there. So yeah, that's exciting to see what's in the future for that area as a whole. Is wrapping up on that note, is there anything that you would say is like a closing message for people considering ASEAN countries as an option, or what they should be prepared for in the process, just as they evaluate that as a potential option?
I would say two things. Number one, it's a whole new world of risk, right? So companies are looking for alternatives and solutions. And so the second thing is they need to be open to different regions that they may not have been experienced before. And they need to do their really good, hard analytical work on comparing different sites in different countries and different options for their locations.
Oh, well said. Anything to add on that, Tondy?
Yeah, this is a fascinating region, and this is also the location of one of the most significant projects in the whole world right now, which is the new capital city of Indonesia, called Nusantara. It's 59,000 hectares. So if you compare to Singapore, Singapore is 66,000 hectares. So this is almost as big as Singapore. And the government is pouring money into this to move the capital city from Jakarta to this in the middle of Indonesia, which is called Nusantara. It is a very, very sustainable city. So it will be powered by sustainable energy. The government is building 4 dams and also a solar farm on the water to power this. Everything is electric vehicle. Public transportations will be electric vehicle. The city is built to be a 10-minute city, so you can walk to all the amenities facilities of the cities within 10 minutes. The entire government offices are moved there. Even the president, the ministers, all the ministerial departments are moving there. So they are creating jobs there and a lot of incentives, grants and incentives. So for instance, I'm an Indonesian, so if I move there, my income tax will be 0. So it's very interesting for all of us because then all of a sudden our salary will be increased by 30% just by moving there. And a lot of incentives that we never heard of in Indonesia, including land title to be 95 years, which is unheard of before. So there is a new policy being issued, 0% income tax if you are into infrastructure. So it's very, very fascinating. If anyone any company is looking into a new opportunity, especially related to sustainability, ESG, this is the location that they should consider.
I'm going to look into that a little bit further. That sounds very
Please.
Yeah. There you go.
What's the best way if people want to get in touch with you to discuss either Southeast Asia or even just discuss Hickey's services and engaging you guys as site selection consultants? What's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Go to our website, hickeyandAssociates.com. A lot of information there. All of our contact information you can find there. You can find us all on LinkedIn also. And I would highly recommend you check out our research papers. We've just released a paper on ESG, but from a standpoint of executing goals, not just talking about them, right? How corporate people, real estate has a tremendous impact on ESG. How do corporate real estate folks actually do the work, right? We've released a great paper on the Inland Empire comparing alternative markets based on the expense there. We've released a paper on, obviously this paper on Southeast Asia, but a lot of good information on incentives. Hickey's one of the major incentives negotiators around the world. So the best avenue to get hold of us is through the website, and I think you'll be fascinating many of the global reports we're putting out on.
Yeah, and I'll leave a link to all of that, to the research side as well as to the one report that we were referencing about the ASEAN nations. So I'll leave links to all that. And then I don't know if I have your LinkedIn, Tondy, if you don't mind sending that to me.
Cool.
And I'll put your LinkedIn descriptions or LinkedIn address in the description as well. So
Thank you.
I do want to thank you guys, and especially you, Tondy, for getting up early for this. But thank you guys for
great podcast, great industrial insights on your LinkedIn. So really enjoy following you. Good stuff.
Well,
Appreciate
likewise. Yeah, those 2 reports that you did send me over were very fascinating. So yeah, you've got a reader in me for sure following along on those, and I'll encourage people to follow along as well. So thanks for the kind words, and mostly just thanks for your time and sharing your wisdom and insights. I found that a very fascinating chat.
Great. Appreciate it.
Okay, Thank you.
Okay, Thanks again, guys.